Hello everybody, thanks for tuning in and welcome to this video presentation on return to play in team sports. My name is Adam Loyakino, Doctor of Physical Therapy and Certified Strength and Conditioning Coach, currently working in the NBA with the Phoenix Suns, serving as their Director of Rehabilitation. Prior to coming out here in Phoenix, I've been working professional team sports for over 10 years now, working primarily in professional basketball and professional soccer. So what is this video presentation about? What are we here to talk about? We're going to talk about unveiling the curtain to how an NBA team approaches return to play. It's a question I get asked quite a bit is, how do you guys do what you do? What are y'all doing behind those closed doors? And we're going to talk about a few of those things without revealing too many secrets. I'm hopeful by the end of this that you'll understand that it's a collaborative effort. There's a lot of different people part of our team. We're very fortunate to have many talented individuals, from strength and conditioning to athletic training to our orthopedic doctors to some of our other specialists. And it's a matter of all of us collaborating together to put together the best plan for the athlete. It's never just one person running the show. It's a lot of different people working together to help each other out. And by the end of this, I'd like to say, you're able to walk away with something. You're able to have some practical strategies, practical performance therapy activities that you can implement today or tomorrow, the next time you see an athlete, so that you can be better at this return to play process. Because as you'll see, there's a lot of question marks in this return to play process. So what is this video not? Just as important as what this is. It's not a clinical case study. We'll use a case study as a means of communication, but it's not going to be every X and O that happened. Same thing, not going to be a rehab protocol. On the other side of it, it's not a theoretical brain dump. Again, my goal for you is to walk away with something practical. We're going to talk about some theory, but again, it's more for practitioners to walk away and have something actionable. Like I mentioned, an ankle sprain we'll use as our means of communication. One of the most popular injuries in, I don't know if popular is the word, maybe most common injuries in basketball. Grade 2, grade 3 will use one of those tweeners, a contact injury stepping on another opponent's foot, and approximately missed about 6 weeks from initial injury to returning to NBA minutes. So like I said, the return to play process, from a criteria perspective, a lot of question marks. There's this systematic review that came out in 2019 relative to lateral ankle sprains, and highlighted in the yellow box says exactly that. There are currently no published evidence-based criteria to inform return to sport decisions. I think that's kind of unique. I think it's exciting at the same time, because as much as we know about the human body and physiology, we still don't have definitive criteria for return to play with ankle sprains. So during this presentation, I'm going to highlight some of the criteria that we use. Willing to bet we're wrong, willing to bet we're right sometimes, but regardless, it's what works for us and who we have on our team and what we believe in based on some principles that we've established. So speaking of principles, the mental model that I created in my own head to just gather my thoughts down. I think it's important, if you ever had the time, to write out your model. How do you think about things? And my model revolves around Simon Sinek's Golden Circle. I'm a fan of Simon and his book Start With Why. And Simon talks about the companies that are successful, the large corporations, the Apples, the Googles. It's not what they do or how they do it. It's why they do what they do. So how do I apply that same concept to the world of physical preparation and return to sport? And I believe in having key principles that guide your process, that then, based on contextual factors on any given day, spit out your plans, right? And that's the model that I used to organize my thoughts and try to progress athletes through our return to play process. So let's start at that inner circle. The key principles that I believe in are established when starting to manipulate variables to bring the athlete back. The first one is movement, primarily how do you coordinate movement? When you're dealing with an injury, oftentimes we're trying to manage the way they move and create strategies that are non-painful for them, right? Getting them to load it again, getting them to understand that, hey, it's not broken. You're not going to hurt it again. You're not going to hurt it anymore right now, right? It's okay to move this. So coordinating movement with novel strategies or just graded exposure to help them get back to the court. The next one is forces, right? How do you manage forces? Primarily force absorption, force production. Now, in this particular video presentation, we're going to talk about how I manipulate forces by managing the joint positions that they're in or how fast they're doing an activity rather than thinking external load and like VBT work, say from the strength and conditioning world. We're going to talk more about general like movement strategies that manipulate forces based on the activity we expose them to. And then fitness. Systemic fitness, global fitness is just as important during rehab as it is during performance training. But we're going to talk about how fitness relates to the local joint as well, right? When you have an injury, that joint is unloaded. And we'll talk about how you have this downward trajectory of a chronic load and how that manifests early on during the rehab process. So you're probably asking, well, why and how did you come up with these principles that you believe in? And maybe you agree with them, and maybe you don't. If you got something else, we'd love to chat more about it and hear your thoughts on it as well. But for what works for me, kind of just diving into some of the research over the years and finding consistent messages that I kept on seeing. So here's some examples of some research that stood out to me over the years as far as why these principles came up. So on this left-hand side, we have a research article that looked at athletes' base level of strength using a trap bar deadlift. I believe it was 3 repetition maximum. And you can see the red box are those that have an increase in potential injury relative to an acute spike in training load. So on the left-hand side, relative to strength, we can see the stronger you are, you'll be able to have 2.5 to 2.9 times your body weight during a trap bar deadlift. You're more likely to be able to tolerate the acute spike in load. And if I look on the right-hand side, same principle, they were choosing aerobic fitness. So that's where these are some examples of why I believe fitness and strength are important, force more specifically. And if we come in and check these other research articles, like diving back into some more research, we have from the top left, again, another one suggesting fitness is protective against injury. Top right, we're looking at grip strength. Grip strength is shown time and time again to be positively correlated with longevity in life. So a longer lifespan, the stronger you are, the longer you live. Right below that, we're talking about lower extremity strength being protective against injury. Another one from the general public is gait speed, right? Gait speed is a manifestation of movement proficiency and be able to and forces as you walk. So the higher your gait speed is, the longer you live potentially. And then bottom right, we're talking about strength, speed, and repeated sprint qualities and how they demonstrate that the stronger, the faster, the more fit you are, the more likely you'll be able to manage the stretchers and not get injured as much, right? So that's where fitness, force, and movement came from how I developed those key principles. One thing we didn't talk about on that last one, right? Player availability. Right? This is something that is important to me as well, and because it helps is what derives some of those principles too, in the sense that our job is player availability in team sports. Sometimes that requires enhancing performance. Sometimes that requires rehabbing an injury. Sometimes that requires doing nothing and letting other people work on some things. Maybe it's technical skill. Maybe it's something off the court, whatever it may be. Our job is player availability. So all these research articles, what are our modifiable risk factors that allow them to be available and can be protective against injury? And that all correlates back to, again, in my mental model, the way I think, to fitness, force, and movement. The process, we'll touch upon these briefly, and we'll talk more about that as we go through the presentation. Experiment and exposure. We don't know what criteria works or what we should be working towards. And I don't always know what's going to be the best activity for the athlete on a given day, right? It may be a kettlebell activity. It may be a wall supported activity. I don't know until I retest, and I'm asking the questions of, is that getting what I'm hopeful for from an output perspective? Are they perceiving the activity in a positive way, meaning they're not in pain, right? And so I'm experimenting day to day, week to week, maybe even in the same session to figure out what works for that athlete. Experimentation is a word that comes up in my mind quite a bit. Exposure, in the context of graded exposure to everything. Exposure is one of these words that I continually see across many different industries. to talk about a few, like in sports and psychology, there's exposure therapy, a strategy to help people manage trauma. Then there's in nutrition. Exposure is either incremental increases or decreases in caloric intake for either weight gain or weight loss. In physical therapy, postoperative rehab protocols, right? Graded exposure to certain movements to help you load that surgical site. Then in strength and conditioning, it's periodization models. Exposure exists so many different industries that it's hard for me not to have it be a part of my mental model. And then plans, right? So we have these plans. Plans are predicated on contextual factors, and the contextual factors exist along this continuum, so to speak, right? So the continuum on the left is health, and on the far right is sport. So at any point in time during the rehab case, we're going to return to play, the athlete exists in one of these subcategories. And the way we've organized it with our team is there's an expert based on skill set, personality, even past experiences managing certain types of injuries, that within each category, they're the expert. That's who's in charge. That's who's running the show. So let's dive a little bit deeper quickly about what each one of these categories is. Health is defined as homeostasis, safety protection relative to an ankle sprain. It's managing the swelling, managing the pain. When we get on over to therapy, if we think of systems thinking, therapy in my eyes is you're constructing the parts, right? It's part, task, motor, learning with respect to biopsychosocial, right? The biological healing time, the social factors of being under pressure, being an injury or pro sports team, and then also the psychological piece, primarily the pain science aspect, right? So in therapy, we're building the parts, because as we get into training, we're really talking about now true system, right? How am I loading this system through gross motor patterns? And when it comes to an injury, I want the athlete to be conscious with what they're doing. I want them to be an active participant. I want them to have effortful, intentional movements so that they understand and teach their body, hey, I can load this again and it doesn't hurt, or I can load this again and I'm not going to be afraid of making it worse, right? Being conscious with what they do. And so those parts that we're working on in therapy should directly connect into what certain whole task strategies we're going to ask this athlete to do. So if I know I'm going to have to work on single leg jumping, well, in part task with therapy, I know I need to make sure I get that ankle range of motion and working on that plantar flexor strength, and also that ability to acceptable load through that ankle as well. So that's how they kind of correlate, or not correlate, but transition along this continuum with that specific exercise. Moving along into performance is we're chasing those external outputs, right? I'm looking for 90% or higher on a force plate counter movement jump, or I'm looking for certain speed threshold, right? 100% of your max in-game speed for linear running. And I want you thinking about it, right? I'm not asking the athlete, hey, think about the way your ankle's moving, think about stepping. No, just to get from A to B, external cueing versus internal cueing. And then sport is a terminal task, but we're all here to chase. So let's take a quick time out here, and let me grab a quick sip of water. Man, talking makes my mouth dry quite a bit. Sports psychology and nutrition, they are a part of our process. We're not going to spend much time talking about them here, but when an athlete gets injured on our team, we offer nutrition consults to manage caloric intake, trying to manage their weight while they're having a decreased amount of activity. Also, seeing if there's any strategies that they would be open to that could help facilitate the healing process, right? So for a ligament injury, should we be introducing a collagen strategy? Are there certain foods that are advantageous for collagen synthesis? Sports psychology, same thing. We're offering a consult to help manage the psychological piece of having an injury, right? Man, it sucks. You take away a part of an athlete's identity when they're hurt because they can't play. And that sometimes can be the roadblock somewhere along the road. So they're a part of our process, but we're not going to spend much time talking about them today. So we talked a little bit about theory, right, leading into this. So now let's get into some of the practical stuff where hopefully you can walk away understanding how we go about what we do and specific examples of what we do. So when we talk about the process and health, our experts, based on past experience and formal training, are a head athletic trainer, our orthopedic doctor, and our foot and ankle specialist. Right, the initial injury happened. Those three, with myself in the background, evaluated the injury, and with imaging, we determined that there was a grade 2, grade 3 ankle sprain with significant amounts of swelling, that with the inability to really load this joint early on. So our goals were protection, right? We're in health, homeostasis, protection, managing the edema, and then gait retraining, because as you'll see, he was in a boot. So before we jump into specifics of what we did during the homeostasis phase, during the health phase, we got to talk about this analogy called the bank briefly, right? And this stems around like concepts of decision fatigue, resource theory, or what's the popular book? The subtle art of not giving an F, right? You only have so many Fs to give in a given day. And I utilize this bank analogy with a lot of my players and a lot of the players, not my players, a lot of the players and a lot of the staff members, trying to demonstrate we need to prioritize and simplify what we're going to do today. So if I gave you $100 today, and the goal, we're in the health phase of the continuum, and the goal is protection, safety, and restore homeostasis. Amongst all of our team members on our staff, who is best equipped to manage that piece? And if our goal is that, then we should allocate all of our resources, all of our Fs, all of our decisions towards that single goal. Not saying weight room activities aren't important. As you see here, they have 0. Not saying basketball is not important. They have 0. But if we have to prioritize and simplify and invest our $100, where are we going to do it for that particular day, for that particular goal? Now, as you see throughout this presentation, the way we allocate resources and invest our money changes as we slide along that continuum. But this is a way for us to understand, oh, today I'm going to do nothing and that's my job. And that's okay. That's part of the process. So specifically, what do we do? Because there was an inability to bear weight early on, a lot of swelling, a lot of fear of walking on it, we decided to boot this athlete for 2 weeks, give him some crutches for the first few days, to help him unload it and protect it and get some confidence back walking on it. For our edema management, our go-to for managing that is Mark Pro and general compression. So Mark Pro is an E-stim unit that you attach on the lower leg that stimulates some of the extrinsic foot muscles, and you give subtle twitches to the ankle to induce low-grade movement to help get rid of some of that swelling out, with compression on top of that as well. Head athletic trainer and our assistant athletic trainer are fantastic at edema management strategies, so we always defer to them for, hey, like, what do you got? They have tricks up their sleeves left and right, and they're a huge help for us in managing this part of the process early on. So now we're sliding into therapy, right? So if we think about criterion-based research, right, the systematic review, we don't know. How do you know when to progress from training to, health to therapy? We started to adopt this phrase towards the end of our season of let it breathe, right? And an injury goes down and everybody wants to jump in and help because we just care for these athletes so much. But sometimes trying to do so much early on is overwhelming, right? And so we adopted this idea of let it breathe. Like, give the athlete, let's give ourselves a day, 2 days, 3 days. Let's manage the acute injury. Let's manage the health aspect. Let's work with the athlete and work amongst ourselves, get our ish together. And when they're ready, when we're ready to be able to progress, that's when we do it. That's when we kind of transition to this therapy side. So let it breathe. And so for us, this was like maybe 3 or 4 days into this, right? And what we decided to start doing was introducing some single leg strength work and some gait retraining while still managing the edema. Our expert here, based on experience and talent and personality, was our performance therapist. So if we slide over and see what we started doing during therapy, we look at the bank now, right? So we're starting to allocate resources a little bit differently. We let it breathe. Athletes ready to start working some more. He wants, like, I want to get back in the weight room. Great, we want to support that decision, and here's what we can do. So the training room gets $75 because we're still trying to manage the health piece while starting to introduce load at a part task strategy, right? Starting to build the parts together. And then the weight room gets about $25. So if we zoom in and see exactly what this is. Therapy, what we started to add in more was open chain and closed chain activities, right? Open chain, ABCs, closed chain, isometric calf raises. Still doing compression, still doing Mark Pro, he's still in the boot. Within the weight room, that's where we started. Our strength and conditioning staff, fantastic at coming up with strategies for athletes that can't load certain tissues but still get a systemic response, right? So utilizing upper body lifting to tax their system while also managing fitness, right? So force and fitness, upper body lifting, fitness, alternative conditioning, anywhere from ropes to med ball to ski erg, and roughly the gross parameters that our staff was using was typically what we had time for was roughly about 30-ish minutes of capacity work, ranging anywhere from high intensity continuous training, HICT, or 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off of low intensity activities. Any variables like that, that's what we did. And it wasn't a science of like exactly this, but those are strategies our strength and conditioning staff decided to use, which was fantastic. Really helped this athlete maintain some fitness and still feel part of the team, right? Be a part of the guys in the weight room, going through some banter, having fun with it. So a quick lesson on fitness that I've seen time and time again during the rehab process, and our strength and conditioning staff noticed this with some of our athletes this year too, is that when we're unable to utilize the lower extremity, it's difficult to get the heart rate above 160. It's just that there's peripheral fatigue in the upper extremities before you get that central adaptation that you're looking for. So when we talk about capacity versus CNS, right, where the capacity, that 30-minute activity, whatever strategy they may use, but then also there's a CNS stimulus that we want to get from a fitness aspect too, right? Be it fitness, as Google defines also, is how prepared you are for a task. But we still want to be able to train the system, although we can't load that ankle. So getting a CNS stimulus from either heavy med ball slams, doing bench press, right? There's a story of Michael Johnson when he was training for a 100-meter sprint. He would go through a period of doing heavy bench pressing to unload his legs, but he'd still see his squat go up, right? So the system doesn't know if it's a bench press or a squat. It just knows I'm getting a maximal output to the CNS system. So that's what we would do as well. Every couple of days, we try to do it every 5-ish days, get some heavy CNS stimulus, either bench pressing or some sort of grip strength activity as well. So when to progress, right? Talking about from health to therapy, letting it breathe, but then more specifically, when do we start to progress therapy to training? Well, we have to respect some biological timelines, right? Biopsychosocial model we mentioned earlier, and understanding where the ligament's at. Right? A grade 2, grade 3 sprain can take anywhere from 4 to 6 or 6 to 12 weeks. So for us, it's a matter of understanding where they're at on a timeline based on foundational science on healing rates of athletes, but then also managing criteria that we're going to start to dive into as to, is he ready? Is he prepared to handle the next progression or not? So how do we do that? So this is where we're going to talk about the fitness component of the local tissue, right? Most oftentimes we talk about local versus systemic fatigue. Systemic fatigue is you're breathing heavy, you're out of breath, your force output's going down. That is a very real and meaningful thing that we try to get ahead of during rehab. But we're going to talk, instead of talking more about that, we're going to talk about the local piece. And we're going to tie in a few principles here, like from acute chronic ratios. Unfamiliar with acute chronic ratios, look up some research. You can look up some research from Tim Gabbett and his group. And more or less, the general consensus is, are you prepared to manage the stressors that we're imposing on you now? Right? Your chronic workload, what have you done over the last several weeks to now what have you done in the last couple of days, and are you prepared to handle that load? So from a local joint perspective, right, this ankle we put in the boot for 2 weeks. So we unloaded it for 2 weeks. So theoretically speaking, his chronic workload went down at his joint, although we were still training his system through alternative methods in the strength and conditioning world. So when we get him out of that boot, I expect that there's going to be an acute spike and workload through that joint, despite the other activities he's been doing to his system. So how do we manage if he's ready to progress or we have to stay? So the 3 criteria we're constantly looking at is as we introduce activity, a progression of activity, we try to only progress 1 or 2 stimuli within a session. We wait 24 hours and we see, how did your body respond? How prepared were you to handle that yesterday? We monitor swelling, monitor pain, and we monitor readiness, right? So pain and swelling are really at the local joint. Like, is there a change, objective change in acute inflammation? Is there a subjective change in pain? But then readiness, globally speaking, we'll ask the athlete on a scale of 0 to 100. 100 being you could go play an NBA game, and 0 being you just got hurt. Where are you at today? And we find that those 3 criteria, as we introduce an experiment with movements and forces and fitness, those seem to be our good criteria, like our criterion-based model that we're always using as we progress through the process. So, quick timeout and just talk about where we're at in this continuum. So we've gone through the health and protection phase, right? Restoring homeostasis, booted for 2 weeks, lots of compression, Mark Pro, we, gait retraining, crutches, really trying to protect that joint. Then we started to slide towards the therapy component where we started building the parts, right? Our performance therapists working on open chain activities to get some ankle range of motion, working on closed chain isometrics, and eventually some concentric eccentric activities too, more dynamic, as precursors for the ability to jump, the ability to run, the ability to change direction. Can you load that part in an isolated activity before we try to put that part within the whole system when we start to enter the training aspect? Early on, our weight room staff had $0 in the bank, right, during the health phase, but as we let it breathe, the athlete was ready. We were ready to start training the system, started introducing a little bit of activity in the weight room, and there was an allocation of roughly $25 to the weight room staff. Basketball staff at this point was still at $0, right? The first 2 weeks, we had a primary goal of restoring homeostasis and introducing part task load. So basketball coaches at the court got about roughly $0 during that phase. And that's where we're at so far. So we're going to jump on over into the training component. So here, our experts are our strength and conditioning coach and our performance therapist, right? They're working in tandem to understand what's he been able to do on the table or in a very isolated activity, and how can I incorporate that into a whole task strategy, right? If we zoom in and look at some of our KPIs, so 2 of the new KPIs that we're looking at, right? So we're still monitoring pain, swelling, and the readiness, but now we're starting to look at subjective qualities, right? Running quality and multi-directional quality. Looking at, like, does that look like how he used to move? What's his body language telling us as he does that movement, right? Nonverbal body language accounts for 93% of how humans communicate. So it's important to, as we put athletes through activities, paying attention to their facial expressions, right? They may not tell you something hurts because maybe there's a perception of they want to do more, they want to get back, right? But you have to pay attention to the other cues as well. Are they grabbing at it? Are they rubbing it after a few minutes, right? Are they kind of taking a few awkward steps after they do a certain movement? Paying attention to those nonverbal cues. So our goals during training were running re-ed, multi-directional re-ed, and start to introduce basketball because he's out of the boot at this phase. We can start getting him on the court. So our bank, you can see a pretty big transition in our bank here, right? He's out of the boot, swelling significantly down, pain is significantly down, he's walking great. Single leg calf strength is fantastic at this point. He's got 25 on one leg. He's doing really well here. So in the training room, right, to me, it's important to understand what the injury was and the type of tissue that was potentially damaged. And so a ligament to me is a massive sensory organ. So, and ligaments help with proprioception. So we decided to implement proprioceptive training through a piece of equipment called Delos. Delos is a wobble board, extremely sensitive, that provides biofeedback. Then because we're out of the boot for 2 weeks, we're in the boot for 2 weeks, not going to be able to load the lower extremity muscles with the external load needed to maintain muscle mass, we decided to implement BFR, blood flow restriction, to bilateral lower extremities, utilizing squats and calf raises, each utilizing the 30-15-15-15 method. So Delos and BFR were alternating days. Delos roughly 3 days a week, BFR 2 to 3 days a week, depending on the schedule. And BFR, we tried to allow at least 48 hours in between sessions. And then we were still doing ankle manual therapy because managing the joint from a range of motion perspective is important, but I also view manual therapy as a desensitization period, right? Putting your hands on the tissue, teaching the athlete it's okay to touch this in your tissue, it's okay to move it. Let me help you move it. Let me make sure the range is good. Let me teach you that this no longer hurts as much as it used to, right? That physical contact is still important. The weight room, we started introducing some progressions of running, linear running, and we're going to talk about these more moving forward. But what we started doing was lunge patterning, the ability to change levels. Lunge patterning, in our eyes, is a precursor to change of direction, deceleration. Can you change levels, flex an ankle, flex a knee, flex a hip? Can you lower your center of mass? Marching before skipping. Marching is just marching in place. It's conscious. You're teaching the body to load that ankle again. And then the progression of skipping, right? So now we're talking about manipulating those principles of force and movement. By skipping, by marching and managing those symptoms, that is a criteria before we go to skipping. Because skipping, because you go faster, we know we're going to introduce more force through that ankle. So that's how we manipulate and expose the athlete to more forces by manipulating the movement and the speed of the movement. Right, and then we'll go to resisted movements, right? So before we jump into those things next, let's talk about briefly about what's going on the court. So our allocation, our bank, right, 10, 50, 40. On the basketball, we're starting to work on some shooting, some ball handling, and some one-on-one script during this training process. So let's talk about some of the movement progressions and some of our basketball progressions moving forward. So some of our sub-principles of movement exposure. When I say sub-principles, it's derived out of like the tactical periodization literature, right? You have your key game principles and you have sub-principles. So our sub-principles of movement relative to basketball, it probably applies to most other sports too. We're most concerned about running, jumping, and change of direction. In this particular case, based on the positional demands of this athlete, we focus primarily on running and change of direction. So that's how, so now we talk about, now we talk about force exposure and how do we expose the athlete to forces by manipulating those movements. So we briefly talked about marching before skipping, right, before another act, before sprinting. Excuse me, let me slow down here. Getting excited because I like this stuff. So marching before resisted, before dribbles, right, made popular by the Altus group. Before assisted, right, band pulling before sprinting. So let's zoom out here. So what we did, right, we manipulated these variables with these activities to expose an athlete to more forces based on what the actual activity was, right? Gray Cook made self-limiting activities popular, right? Put them in positions or activities that just manipulate things without having to think about it, right? So marching in place, it's rhythmic, it's conscious. Resisted, right? Now we start adding a little bit of force. Resistance slows it down, but I have to have you put more force into the ground and be conscious of what you're doing. So what did that look like for us in this particular case? Marching in place, then marching moving forward. Then, okay, I'm going to put a band around your waist. I'm going to have you march moving forward. And then once we got past that phase, still keeping in this rhythmic conscious effort, right, during training, we went into the dribbles. So just a little bit more ground contact times, getting back to running. And then we did assisted. We didn't actually do assisted in a linear fashion. We did assisted with our multi-directional stuff, which we'll talk about more as well. And then we went to sprinting. So now you can see how these criteria of marching, resisted activity, dribbles, 24 hours after we introduced the activity, we're monitoring pain, we're monitoring swelling, we're monitoring readiness. Did you tolerate those things well? And what we found out from a training density perspective with this athlete early on was if we had those incremental progressions each day, he did well with 2 days of incremental progressions. If we did it on the 3rd day, he'd come back in on the 4th day and there'd be changes in swelling, pain, and readiness. So we decided, okay, from a training density, we're going to go high, high, low, high, high, low, progress, maintain or drop it down, progress, maintain, and drop it down. Other guidelines that we use are single effort attempts before multiple effort attempts, isometric activities before tempo, before dynamic, then anticipatory before reactive. So I'm going to tell you what exactly I'm going to expect you to do. So I need you to run from A to B to C, right? So you can plan it, you can anticipate what's going to happen. And then I need you to be reactive, okay? I'm going to point to a different direction, and then you got to go. So anticipatory before reactive. So we talked about how we expose movement and expose movement and expose forces. So now let's talk about exposure to basketball. So generally speaking, these are some of our guidelines that we use, our criteria for non-contact progressions and contact progressions, right? Roughly, we're trying to get 30 minutes at each one of these. So form shooting, catch and shoot, dribble pull-up, so on and so forth. And as you see, each one of these stages, by design, manages the intensity. So if we keep volume the same, 30 minutes, right? We never change the volume, 30 minutes. And if we just manipulate the intensity, that is an exposure to forces and an increase along the way. And it's important to highlight that for the athlete, because sometimes if they keep seeing 30 minutes, 30 minutes, 30 minutes, they don't see that as a progression. You know, we had to communicate a lot of times, hey, like, you won the day today because yesterday you were only able to do 25 minutes of catch and shoot, and today you could do 30 minutes of catch and shoot with a little bit of dribble pull-ups, right? There's only small incremental changes, but when you work with athletes day to day, it's those small wins that matter and help them maintain the idea that, okay, I'm progressing forward. And it's okay to maintain a day or two in a row, because maintenance in the longer picture, right? A week ago, you're only able to do 3 days a week. Well, now we were able to do 5 days a week, right? You maintained that effort over 5 days instead of 3 days. Finding those wins and helping them realize those wins is just as important as planning this whole thing out as well. So this is the exciting part for me, where we get to manipulate drills based on what we've been able to demonstrate from a movement and a force exposure with this training staff and the therapy staff. So one goal that I always have is, can I replace drills? When I say drills, I mean marching drills, running drills, change of direction drills with sport, right? So this right here is exactly what we did for roughly 10 stages of running change of direction in basketball, right? Trying to do stage 1 before stage 2. Now, we didn't always do stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 right in a row. Sometimes we found out that, hey, the athlete was able, if we go all the way to the right side on basketball, I was down there watching with him on the court, and I thought we were going to do just form shooting that day, stage 1. But as the progression's going on and we're checking in with him during the session, like, hey, no change in symptoms, none of that, he's able to pull up and do dribble up pull-up shots, right? Dribble, pull-up, jump shots. And so now I go back to our strength and conditioning staff and say, hey, we can bypass marching. Like, I think he's ready to handle some resisted training. So we skip stages 2 and 3 on the running side, because in the basketball component, based on intensity, we believe that if you can tolerate one of those 3 categories across the stage, you may be able to tolerate either plus or minus 2, is what I roughly say, on the other 3 categories. Right? So it's a matter of, can I get this guy on the court sooner? So he smells the ball, he sees the ball go in the hoop, he's working with his sport coaches, he's around his teammates, rather than keep having isolated off-court workouts to work on some physical qualities. Can we all tie it together, right? Tactical periodization, can we tie it all together by managing a couple different things within the drill as well? And so constantly working with the sport coach, they're fantastic. When it comes to an injury, like, hey, let me know what we need today and we'll create it. So that chart right there, I'll zoom in one more time for you. This right here is how we decided to manage forces, manage movement, based on the activity that we expose them to do across 3 different categories. All right. Let's take a brief time out just to circle back on this concept. So the whole purpose of the continuum and a consistent principles and process is to be able to connect certain departments and certain people to have communication about a consistent goal, right? There's expressions I hear too often in professional sports or team sports. There's silos. There's the medical group. There's the therapy group. There's the performance group. Man, they're doing rehab and they won't only train the guy. Or there's gaps between departments. And I believe that that happens because there's a lack of understanding of what guiding principles we're all working towards, or what is the consistent communication, consistent language that we can all use. So trying to connect and appreciate who the expert is and what, but working towards the same thing of running, jumping, and change direction, right? Are you doing that? Are you putting the parts together for that? Or are you creating the parts? Are you putting the parts together in training, right? All based on similar principles so that there is this consistent flow and it doesn't seem disjointed. And it's what's working for us, right? It's that the communication, that mentality is what's working. It's not perfect by all means. We've made mistakes amongst ourselves. We've disagreed. Like, we are not perfect. It's not all rainbows and butterflies. And I think that's a good thing. Dare to disagree. Great TED Talk if you haven't seen it. Disagreement's good. It's needed, because if everybody's a yes man, then how do you know what you're actually doing is right? You got to challenge one another, but in a way that's consistent and you communicate your thoughts. All right, so that was jumping to performance, and this is where we start to really be hands off, and we're kind of just managing the situation at this point. So performance, our experts were a strength and conditioning coach, director of performance, right? Some specific criteria that we start to look at, right? Force plates, in-game running speed, and practice participation in basketball. So a criteria that I like to see when it comes to return to play is I'm more concerned about intensities than volume early on. So I want to see, can you hit intensities of greater than 90% of your counter movement jump on your force plates? And our director of performance and his sports science staff are huge help for me when analyzing that data, because that is not that's not my cup of tea. Then I want to see, can you 100% max game speed? Can we figure out how fast you run in the game? We're fortunate enough to have that data, and then show me that just in a simple sprint you can hit that threshold, that intensity. And then from a basketball participation, one of the more intense drills that we see, excuse me, is something that's called shell. And what shell is, it's within the perimeter, and it's a very intense, reactive, multi-directional defensive drill. For an ankle, I think that's important to be able to tolerate reactive, multi-directional activities in an uncontrolled environment, which is sport. So the bank here, let's zoom in on the bank. So we're still doing Dalo, still doing BFR, just a little touch and go on the manual therapy. Now we're probably here in the category of, from a timeline perspective, more like the 4 to 5 week mark. And weight room has a little bit of money still, really working on those end stage motor tasks, right? Like reactive drills, full court sprinting, assisted multi-directional drills. And then basketball, we're having our progressions on court. So I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about assisted when it came to multi-directional. So this assisted is pulling you towards me rather than you pulling me. And what that does is, in my eyes, the goal of assisted, right? This is one perspective. I know there's a couple different perspectives with assisted activities, right? It's RNT, it's PNF, it's inducing contact. That's the way I view it. From a sport perspective, if I pull you towards me, it's someone pushing you from the other side, which is important in a sport like basketball because that's always happening, right? Boxing out, knocking each other over. It also, for an ankle, creates an overload stimulus for lateral stabilization of an ankle. So that's what I mean by assisted multi-directional drills. And our strength and conditioning staff spent some great time with Lee Taft this past season and learned a lot from him. So Lee was a huge help in implementing some strategies relative to this part of our return to play process. Basketball exposure. This is a chart that I borrowed over from my time in soccer, and it's relative to small sided games. And although we're talking about soccer and the dimensions are all soccer there, I can still pull the same principles from there and implement them with basketball. So it's relative to small sided games. And there's a lot of research that's come out of football, Aussie rules football, rugby, soccer, especially overseas, and knowing if I create this small-sided game, 3v3, 6v6, 8v8, and I do it in a certain amount of space, what are the force outputs? What part of the system am I stressing? So let's dive a little bit deeper here and talk about this briefly. So in the bottom left corner, I have very small numbers, very small spaces. In the top right, I have very large spaces, very large numbers. And then along that continuum from bottom left to top right, As I introduce space and I introduce numbers, as you can see here, the stimulus that is being provided to the athlete is different. So why is this important, and why do I share this with you? Well, during the return to play process, my model, my theory, I believe in obtaining intensity first before capacity. So that's why in our process, I like to see 1v1 first. I want to see an accelerative strength-based activity with low volume before I start introducing capacity work of like 5v5 in the full court. Right? So each drill, depending on time, depending on space and numbers, you're going to get a different stimulus. It's not just a matter of going out and playing games for playing games. We can be a little bit more strategic for when and how much we do certain small-sided game based on the research that's come out of a lot of the soccer. And they're starting to study it in basketball as well. So our process here, right? Again, very hands-off at this point for the most part. We're just managing and communicating with coaches. Our director of performance is the expert here. He understands a lot of data that goes into minutes played and intensities, so he's fantastic with that. And our KPIs were minutes played and practice participation, right? Goal is to play game minutes, but also have full participation in practice too. So as we zoom in on this next bank here, little bit, right? Most of it's on the basketball court, right? Our coaches now have $80, right? We only have 10 and 10 in the weight room and training. So at this phase, we're right around 5-6 weeks here and still doing Delos, right? Proprioceptive training. And this athlete did Delos throughout the season following this injury. Right? He just became a regular, like, hey man, you had an injury. Pre-existing injury is the #1 risk factor for a future injury. So we're gonna get ahead of the curve here. We kept on doing Delos, kept on doing proprioceptive training, right? Manual therapy, just touch and go, make sure it's good. Weight room, unrestricted training. So he's with the team, he's doing what everybody else is doing, nothing special for him. And then basketball court, let's talk about how we like to progress minutes when it comes to end stage return to play. So general rule of thumb is we want to see a full participation in practice first. And not like a off day practice, but like a good intense practice where you're getting up and down the court, you're going through some script, a little bit of live play. And then we want to, if we have the availability based on our schedules, in this particular case we were, send the player to the G League with one of our staff members, because G League minutes are less intense than NBA minutes, right? Graded exposure to forces based on the skill level, based on the league, right? That stuff matters too. And general progression, we're not criteria. We know there's nothing that's substantial. We know there's nothing that is definitive. So where do we start? 50% of typical game minutes, progress roughly 75, no more than next to 75%. And then 100% game minutes. How much they spend in each one of those phases? Well, it's dependent upon how they respond. If we're managing pain, soreness, swelling, and readiness, and if he tolerates 50% really well, like nothing, all right, let's go up, let's progress more. But then he comes back and he says, ooh, that was too much. Like, I'm a little bit sore today, I have a little bit of swelling. And then it's all right, well, we're going to stay closer to 60% rather than 75%, right? It's not an exact science, it's an art, constantly working with the athlete, working with the coaches to understand where he's at and what can he do and what is safe and what are they ready to, or how much are they ready to handle is what I meant to say there. So that's how we expose basketball. So that kind of wraps it up, right? So you saw how we went from health side of the continuum all the way to the sports side of the continuum. I apologize if I talked a little bit too fast during some of it. This stuff gets me excited. I love doing this stuff. It's fun. Collaborating with people is what I enjoy most, and being able to just integrate different concepts to really progress the athlete and get them back on the court. Like I mentioned, we're not perfect. We make mistakes, especially as a new staff this year. We had to learn who each other were, and that takes time. There's nothing more than time helps you learn about each other, and certain situations afford you opportunities to learn more about each other. So this particular opportunity was, an injury. So who stepped up to the plate? And we talked about those things. And what we learned early on was we had to realign our experts, right? Based on skill set, based on experience, who was best equipped to handle certain things. Our assistant strength and conditioning coach is fantastic at coaching and cueing change of direction and creating those motor strategies, right? Anticipatory before reactive. He's fantastic at that. That was his skill set. So he was our expert in that. Our performance therapist, her demeanor is just fantastic, like so soothing and peaceful. She was our expert in therapy. And we didn't really figure that out until we started getting into it and understanding, okay, when it's time to introduce training, so-and-so is going to do this. When it's time to manage the ankle, so-and-so is going to do this. All right, one question I found myself asking about our staff was, what can each person do that no one else can do better? Or by scope of practice, what can you do that no one else can do? And that's where the bank strategy kind of evolved. The bank analogy evolved out of was trying to realign our experts to understand who was best equipped to manage what during the process. Now, we did have a miscommunication during a creation of a basketball drill. In a nutshell, we thought we explained the intensity we wanted, particularly for this drill with this athlete, with the coach. And as with the drills going on, we're noticing the intensity is a little bit harder and higher than we expected. So rather than stopping the drill right in the middle, we just observed it, talking to the athlete, seeing how he was doing. Everything was going well. And that's one of those days where the plan was X and ended up being Y. That's where the word experimentation comes to mind. It's like, well, I thought, but I kept testing, retesting, right? Scientific method of talking to the athlete, change in symptoms, change in pain. Are there any movement patterns that are different? And none of that happened. So although there was a miscommunication, we still managed it. We were still there. And then at one point towards as we started talking about game minutes and where the athlete may or may not be going, we educated too much on the plan to the point where it led us down this path of daily conversations of athlete wanted to do more. We didn't think he was actually quite there yet, but one saying the other. And so we realized we want to educate and have the athlete be a part of the process, but also understanding where that fine line of educating too much or sharing too much of the plan to the point it bites you in the butt in the end. So those are some things like part of our autopsy that we realized, again, we're learning. No one knows this exact method, but this seems to what worked for us and worked in this particular case. So if we wrap up quickly here, principles, process, plans, 3P. What are your guiding principles that lead to a consistent process? And then your plans are predicated on those principles through that process, right? Experiment and exposure are key components of what we do. Because again, we don't know everything that's going on, but we got to test, retest, manage, and monitor what the athlete's doing and what we're doing, not just us, but also every involved party having an idea of all the stressors that are being imposed, right? So we've got to gradually expose through all departments. And that's where the collaboration comes in. All departments involved, all parties involved. Utilize the talents that we have, right? Utilize the people that you know. Get the experts in the room. Disagree in the context, not because you think they're wrong and you're right, but just questioning, is this what's best for this particular context, for this particular athlete, right? It's important to collaborate. And I'm hopeful that I highlighted that for you. And I'm pretty fortunate to work with some amazing people here. So thank you, y'all. That was fun. Haven't done many of these, so I got to be real. Talking to a computer is a bit different for me. I'd much rather talk to you face to face. So if you're ever in the Phoenix area, by all means, look me up. Love to connect, share ideas. Also, if you have any thoughts on the video, by all means, reach out over social media, Instagram, slide into those DMs, right? It's cool. I love talking to people. I hope you learned something. I hope you walk away with some practical strategies. I look forward to maybe doing this again with y'all. Talk to you soon.